At a grocery store checkout in Chicago, Clara Bennett's card declined on the only formula her baby daughter could survive on. She set the can back on the shelf, her dignity cracking under fluorescent lights, unaware a billionaire in line nearby was watching. That single moment would braid their lives together, pulling a struggling single mom into a legacy of war heroes, family secrets, and a battle for justice that could change everything. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. The story of Clara Bennett begins in the kind of moment most people pretend they don't see. Fluorescent lights hum. A register beeps. Grocery store air smells like cut cantaloupe and bleach. In the express lane at a South Side Chicago supermarket, Clara stands with a single item in her cart. One can of hypoallergenic infant formula. Her winter coat is thrift store navy, a little shiny at the elbows, and her hair is up in a no-nonsense knot that says she did not come here to be noticed. Still, the way her fingers hold that can, thumb pressed on the label like a promise, gives her away. She has done the math twice. She always does the math twice. A coupon clipped from a Sunday circular, a store loyalty discount, a swipe of the card after payday deposits clear at midnight. And yet today, somehow, the numbers didn't land where she needed them to. Next, the cashier says, bored and kind in the way bored people can be when they choose to be. Clara places the can on the belt like she's setting down a sleeping child. The belt carries it past a magazine promising 10-minute dinners and glowier skin. The scanner chirps. The price winks red on a little screen, higher than milk, higher than rent should allow. She inserts her card, steadying her breath, thinking of her daughter Isla back at the apartment. A soft wheeze in the early hours. The way the pediatrician had tapped the chart and said, "This one works. Don't switch." Declined. The screen prints it in unfriendly font. The cashier glances up, then back to the screen, then tries again, because that's what decent people do when indecency arrives disguised as a technical error. Clara tries again, too. She knows the feel of the card, the smudge of the strip, the exact angle it likes. Declined. The beep suddenly sounds louder than it is. A boy in a hoodie stops unloading his Doritos. The woman behind him places her rotisserie chicken very quietly on the belt, as if noise will make it worse. Clara swallows. In another life, maybe she'd blame the bank, the system, the universe, but she doesn't have bandwidth for blame. She has a baby at home who cannot drink what other babies drink. The formula is the difference between Isla sleeping and Isla rasping against her mother's chest. The difference between the daycare calling to say she's not keeping anything down and texting a photo of a finger-painted son. "Do you want to try a different card?" the cashier asks. Clara shakes her head once. She has one card. It is not a secret. Her life is that simple and that complicated at the same time. She reaches for the can, feels the shape of it in her palm. Light in the way medicine is light, more idea than object. Then she does the thing that decent people sometimes have to do to survive. She returns the can to the end cap. She places it back between a pyramid of cheaper formulas and a row of powdered cereal, like she's tucking it in where it will be safe until she can come back for it. Somewhere in the store, a child laughs. Water over stones. Somewhere else, a cart squeaks. For 3 seconds, the lane is a hush. It is not reverent. It is a flinch. The kind of silence that follows a plate hitting the floor in a crowded diner. People want to help, and they want to be invisible at the same time. A man 2 lanes over watches without meaning to. He is tall in the way men are when they forget to stoop to the world's height. He wears an expensive coat that looks like it never learned the word stain. His name is Daniel Whitmore, and if you Googled him, if Clara had time to Google anyone, you would find a portfolio of companies, a philanthropic foundation with a tasteful serif logo, and a photo of a father and son at a Little League field, hat brims touching. He is here because his son likes the supermarket's ridiculous robot floor cleaner, and because even billionaires need bread and bananas. Daniel does not know the price of infant formula offhand. He does know the sound of a card declining he once heard at 22 in a borrowed suit at an airport kiosk, buying a tie for the interview that changed his life. He recognizes the way Clara straightens her shoulders, the small ritual of dignity people perform when the world is watching. He sees her leave without her purchase. Clara does not leave swiftly. Swift implies a clean exit. She moves with the careful choreography of keeping things from breaking. Budget, pride, the brittle shell of a day you have to get through. The night before, she rolled coins to make bus fare. This morning, she counted the hours of Isla's breathing between coughs. In the afternoon, she has a double shift at the diner. Her body keeps time with these things automatically, inhaling when the bus arrives, exhaling when the manager turns his back, steadying when Isla smiles around a bottle like the sun punching through clouds. At the sliding doors, the cold makes her eyes water. Chicago in late winter is a long conversation with wind that never lets you finish a sentence. She tucks her chin down, zips her coat to her throat, and pushes the cart to the corral even though it's empty. She has been taught to leave a place better than she found it. Daniel pays for his groceries, and for the first time since he learned how to sign a check with a number he once thought belonged only in movies, he hesitates. Not because he doubts his impulse, but because he understands what help can feel like when it's offered in public. A blade with 2 edges. He knows something else, too. If he does nothing, he will carry the snapshot of that returned can with him like a stone in his shoe. He leaves without approaching her, the calculation landing on what he can do that will not turn a woman into a headline in his own mind. That decision will matter later. For now, it means he follows the mundane order of the day. Car, call, meeting. Clara walks home hugging her coat to her, counting blocks in the language of Chicago, corner stores and shuttered barbershops, murals of faces that look like neighbors and saints, a vacant lot where winter grass is the color of tea bags. She cuts through an alley that smells faintly of fried oil, thinking about whether she can ask her landlord for 2 more days, whether she can split the last can of formula into smaller portions if she warms it in a bowl the way the nurse showed her. She thinks about how Isla's eyes track the ceiling fan like a constellation. In the apartment, the heat clanks awake like a reluctant dragon. Isla is down for a short nap, socks kicked half off her feet in the universal baby language of, "I fought sleep and lost." Clara kneels by the crib, her breath settling into the rhythm of her daughter's. She doesn't let herself cry because crying takes time and fluid and leaves a headache that makes the dinner rush harder. Instead, she reaches for the calendar stuck to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a peach. 2 shifts today. Rent due Friday. Pediatrician next Tuesday if nothing derails. Nothing can derail. There are people who believe rock bottom is dramatic. A crash. A siren. A courtroom. For Clara, it is an ordinary checkout line. A beep. An object set back on a shelf. The quiet after. She rinses a bottle, scrubs the ring, lines everything up like soldiers waiting for orders, and tells herself a story she can believe for the next 15 minutes. Today will hold. The bus will be on time. The diner will be full. Tips will be good. And somehow, before midnight, she will find a way back to that store. What she doesn't know yet is that two separate histories have already started to braid themselves around her day. One belongs to a man who could buy every can on that shelf and never notice the line item. The other belongs to a generation that once made promises in places far from Chicago and kept them for decades. Those histories are walking toward her even now, carried by errand and accident, by the strange, stubborn physics of a city where people's lives knock together like cups in a sink. For the moment, there is only a mother checking the time, a baby stirring, and the taste of winter in the air through a draft in the kitchen window. The next part of her life waits at the diner, in a corner booth where a man who saw everything and said nothing will soon sit down to order soup. The can she placed back on the shelf will still be where she left it. Stories sometimes begin not with a yes, but with a not yet. The diner's neon sign sputtered in the gray afternoon, buzzing faintly against the March wind. Clara Bennett pushed through the heavy glass door with her apron already tied, her shoulders stiff from the long walk. Inside, the smell of fryer oil clung to the booths, the kind of scent that didn't wash out of clothes even after 2 laundromat cycles. This was her second home, though never by choice. She slipped behind the counter, checking the clock above the coffee machine. 10 minutes to the lunch rush. 10 minutes before she had to stretch a smile across her face and pretend her feet weren't still raw from the night shift before. Every hour mattered. Every tip was a bottle of formula or another day of heat in the apartment. Isla's doctor's words played on a loop in her mind. Special formula only. Otherwise, we risk more than allergies. More than allergies meant infections, weakened lungs, even hospitalization. Clara kept those words folded up tight like a paper she couldn't throw away. She rubbed her thumb across the order pad, counting silently how many shifts were left before rent came due. Rent was always the shadow in the room. Her paycheck from the diner barely covered it. One late fee and she could be staring down eviction. And if Isla's weight slipped too low, child services could intervene. The thought made her chest tighten. No one talked about that part of poverty, the fear that your love wasn't enough to prove you could keep your own child safe. "Bennett!" The bark came from Frank, the manager, his tie crooked, his belly pressing against the buttons of his shirt. He tossed a rag onto the counter. "Table 6 spilled water again. Move faster, would you?" Clara nodded, biting back the reply that wanted to rise. She moved, efficient, quiet, but Frank wasn't done. He leaned on the counter as she wiped the booth. "You know, some people just aren't cut out to raise kids. Nothing wrong with admitting you're in over your head." Her hand stilled on the rag. She didn't lift her eyes. She knew better. Words were ammunition in Frank's world, and she couldn't afford to give him any. She gathered the glasses, carried them to the back, and let the sting of his comment dissolve into the clatter of dishes. By noon, the diner filled, construction workers ordering burgers, office staff hunched over salads, regulars drinking coffee like medicine. Clara moved between tables with practiced rhythm. When she turned to deliver a bowl of soup to a corner booth, her steps faltered. There he was, Daniel Whitmore. She recognized him instantly, the tall man from the supermarket, the one who'd seen her at the register when her card had failed. He wasn't alone. Across from him sat a woman in a sharp gray suit, hair pinned with diamond clips that caught the light. Victoria Hensley. Clara didn't know her by name yet, but the woman's gaze was cool, assessing, the kind that made people shrink without realizing why. Daniel's eyes flicked up as Clara approached, and in that brief moment, recognition passed between them. He remembered. Clara forced her posture straight, steadying the tray. She would not let the shame of that supermarket aisle follow her here. Not in this uniform, not with Isla's future riding on every dollar she earned today. She placed the soup gently in front of him, her hands sure. Daniel nodded, polite but searching, as if trying to fit this waitress into the frame of the mother he had seen. Clara turned away quickly, retreating to the counter. She could feel Victoria's eyes linger, a faint curl of disdain tugging at her lips. Clara kept moving. Orders to fill, tables to clear, rent to make. Always rent, always Isla. The lunch rush swelled until the diner buzzed like a beehive. Coffee cups clinked against saucers, the hiss of the grill mixed with laughter, and orders shouted from the kitchen filled the air. Clara carried plates with the balance of someone who couldn't afford mistakes. Pancakes on one arm, fries, and a milkshake on the other. At table 9, she set down a burger without breaking stride, but her chest tightened as her eyes slid toward the corner booth. Daniel Whitmore sat there, leaning slightly forward, the posture of a man used to listening and being listened to. Across from him, Victoria Hensley radiated the kind of presence that bent rooms toward her. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the diamond clips in her hair throwing sparks whenever she moved her head. Clara steadied herself, approaching with the coffee pot. "Refill?" she asked softly. Daniel gave a small nod, his gaze lingering on her face, the unspoken memory of the supermarket checkout hanging between them. Clara kept her eyes on the cups, filling them carefully. Victoria leaned back, lips curving into a cold smile. "Well, isn't this convenient? The very picture of America's misplaced sympathies." Daniel's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Victoria tilted her head toward Clara. "People like her. Barely scraping by, always with a handout. They drain the system, burden the rest of us, and we're expected to clap for it." The words struck like a slap. Clara froze, coffee pot mid-air. For a heartbeat, the clatter and hum of the diner seemed to fade. She steadied her hand, set the pot back on its warmer, and forced herself to walk away without reacting. Frank, the manager, caught the tail end of it and chuckled from behind the counter. "She's got a point, you know," he muttered loudly enough for the nearby customers to hear. "Some folks just aren't fit to raise kids." Heat rose up Clara's neck, but she kept moving, her steps measured. She'd learned long ago that dignity was sometimes the only weapon left when you couldn't afford to fight. Still, the words burrowed deep. They carried the weight of every sleepless night, every overdue bill, every moment she wondered if the world was waiting for her to fail. Daniel's jaw tightened. He set down his spoon with a deliberate clink. "That's enough, Victoria." But Victoria only smiled wider, as though his defense proved her point. "Daniel, you're too soft. Compassion has a cost. You'll see." Clara retreated behind the counter, fingers pressed hard against the edge until her knuckles whitened. She had no shield against voices like Victoria's. Wealthy, polished, confident. They could dismiss her entire existence with a shrug. And yet, somewhere inside her, a small ember refused to go out. She glanced toward the kitchen, inhaled, and forced herself back into motion. Orders to take, bills to tally, customers to serve. The rest of the shift blurred. Plates out, checks dropped, tips gathered in her apron pocket like fragile promises. But the words lingered, gnawing at her resolve. By the time the diner emptied and the neon sign buzzed again in the window, Clara knew one thing. People like Victoria saw her as invisible until it was time to sneer. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't imagine, was that her quiet refusal to break in that moment had planted a seed in Daniel's mind. He had seen her strength once at the register, now again under the weight of public humiliation. And though Clara walked home believing she had endured just another ordinary day, forces much larger than she realized were already beginning to shift. The dinner crowd moved slower than lunch, a quieter hum filling the diner. Clara wiped down a booth, her mind still circling the sharp sting of Victoria Hensley's words. She carried those insults like stones in her apron, heavy but hidden. Rent, Isla's health, custody fears. Those were her daily battles. But judgment from strangers carved a wound she could not show. The bell over the door jingled. A tall man with a gray scarf stepped in, scanning the menu posted above the counter. His accent, when he asked for a seat, clipped and deliberate, carried Europe with it. Clara guided him to a booth near the window, placed a menu down, and offered the practiced smile she reserved for new customers. Minutes later, she returned with her order pad. The man pointed to an item, speaking in halting English. "This is not correct, yes? Menu, how you say, mistake?" His frustration rose as he gestured sharply, his words tripping over one another. A couple at the next table glanced over. Clara opened her mouth, then paused. She recognized the cadence instantly. German. The language of lullabies, of letters tucked in her father's drawers from years long past. Before she could think twice, she answered in fluent, steady German, her voice smooth as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. "Es gibt keinen Fehler, sir," she said gently, explaining the dish, the ingredients, even suggesting an alternative he might like better. The man's entire posture shifted. Relief spread across his face, his shoulders loosening. "Ah, sehr gut," he replied, suddenly animated, smiling at her as though she had thrown him a lifeline. They continued the exchange easily, Clara moving with confidence she hadn't felt in years, the old vocabulary returning like an old friend. From the corner booth, Daniel Whitmore's spoon froze halfway to his mouth, his eyes locked on her, startled by the transformation. A waitress in a threadbare apron, fluent in a language many people spent years struggling to master. His mind buzzed with questions. How, where, why, but above all, with respect. Victoria, however, looked unimpressed. She arched an eyebrow and muttered, "Parlor tricks, nothing more." But Daniel wasn't convinced. When Clara returned to the counter, Frank smirked. "Didn't know you were hiding that, Bennett. Thought your talent stopped at carrying trays." Clara kept her head down, focusing on stacking cups. She didn't answer. She didn't need his approval. Inside, though, something stirred, a reminder that she was more than the uniform she wore, more than the paycheck she scraped together every week. Her father's voice echoed faintly in memory. "Never forget what you've been given. One day, it may save you." As she passed by Daniel's table again, she caught his gaze. It wasn't pity. It was curiosity, a spark of recognition, as though he had glimpsed a page of a story he hadn't expected to find in this diner. The German customer left a generous tip and a grateful nod. Clara slipped the bills into her apron pocket, whispering thanks under her breath. She didn't notice Victoria's narrowed eyes or the way Daniel leaned back in thought, piecing together fragments of her resilience. The night wore on, but Clara carried with her something more than exhaustion. She carried proof, quiet, undeniable, that her life still held hidden strengths. She might be one paycheck away from collapse, but beneath the surface ran threads of legacy, skills inherited, and a voice that could not be silenced. By the time Clara pushed open the apartment door, night had pressed down over Chicago. The radiator hissed in protest, coughing out uneven warmth that never quite reached the corners. She hung her coat on the back of a chair, then bent to lift Isla from the crib. The little girl stirred, cheeks flushed, fists curling in the universal language of babies who had fought sleep all evening. Clara pressed her daughter close, inhaling the powdery scent of lotion and faint milk. The exhaustion of double shifts, cruel words, and unpaid bills clung to her shoulders. But in this moment, none of it mattered. Isla blinked up at her, eyes dark and searching, as though waiting for proof that the world was still safe. The old rocking chair creaked as Clara settled into it. She swayed gently, back and forth, the rhythm instinctive. From deep in memory rose a melody she hadn't sung in years, a German lullaby her father had carried home from his service overseas. Soft syllables shaped the air, wrapping mother and child in something older than both of them. Schlaf, Kindlein, schlaf. The words felt foreign and familiar at once, like stepping into a house you'd left long ago but still knew by heart. Isla's breathing slowed. Her tiny hand tugged at the bracelet around Clara's wrist, a handmade band of soft fabric, stitched from scraps of an old shirt. Clara had pieced it together during long nights when Isla was a newborn, each stitch a quiet vow. Now she slipped it gently onto Isla's wrist, letting it dangle loose. "This is yours, my love," she whispered, "so you'll always carry a piece of me." The bracelet was nothing more than fabric, but it carried weight, a symbol of family, of love that refused to vanish even when the world tried to strip everything else away. Clara imagined Isla years from now, holding that bracelet the way she herself had once held her father's medals, tokens of sacrifice, of roots that mattered. Outside, a siren wailed down the street, fading into the distance. Clara hummed louder, shielding her daughter from the city's unrest with the fragile armor of song. For a moment, she let her guard fall. Tears pricked her eyes, not from weakness, but from the aching tenderness of wanting more for her child than she had ever been given. She thought of her father again, his stories of Germany, his quiet pride, the way he had taught her words she never believed would matter. And yet tonight, those words had smoothed over conflict, earned respect, even reminded her of the strength still alive inside her. Perhaps, she thought, he had known one day she would need them. Isla drifted into sleep, lips parting, lashes dark against her skin. Clara laid her gently in the crib, adjusting the blanket. She touched the bracelet once more, a promise sealed in cloth. In the dim apartment, surrounded by unpaid bills stacked like warning signs on the counter, Clara allowed herself one breath of peace. Tomorrow would bring rent, double shifts, and judgment. But tonight she had this, a sleeping child, a song carried across generations, and the quiet certainty that love, though fragile, though poor, was still enough to hold them both. Daniel Whitmore rarely lingered over details. His life moved in schedules and contracts, calendar blocks that left little room for chance. Yet something about the waitress from the diner would not leave his thoughts. The sound of her German, fluid and effortless, clung to him like a refrain. 2 days later, in his office overlooking the city, Daniel sifted through a stack of papers sent by his research assistant. He had asked, casually, he told himself, for background on Clara Bennett. Nothing invasive, just enough to answer the questions circling his mind. Among the notes lay a yellowed photocopy of a military record. Daniel frowned, leaning closer. The name leapt from the page. James Bennett, decorated World War II veteran, stationed in Europe, awarded a commendation for saving the life of a fellow soldier near Aachen. Daniel's chest tightened. He knew that name, not James Bennett, but the man saved. His own grandfather, Richard Whitmore. The story had been told in fragments at family gatherings. A soldier pulled from a collapsed trench, a stranger's courage carving the line between life and home. Tom. Without that act, Daniel's entire family tree would look different. Without that act, Daniel himself would not exist. He sat back, the weight of it settling. The waitress, the struggling single mother he'd seen at the supermarket checkout. She was the great-granddaughter of the man who had once given his grandfather a second chance at life. Their paths had crossed not by accident, but by the quiet geometry of legacy. For a long moment, he stared at the city lights, cars threading down the avenues. Wealth, success, reputation, those had always defined his story. But here was something older, more binding, a debt carried across generations. Later that evening, he walked into his study where a photograph hung above the fireplace. His grandfather in uniform, smiling beside an unnamed comrade. Daniel had seen the photo countless times without asking the other man's name. Now, at last, he knew. James Bennett. The realization shifted something in him. This was no longer about charity or pity. It was about honoring a thread that had been woven long before either he or Clara were born. That night, Daniel drafted the first outline of an idea. A fund dedicated to the descendants of veterans who had given so much, yet left families struggling decades later. He would call it the Bennett Legacy Fund, a tribute to one man's sacrifice, and a bridge into the future for his family's line. At the diner the next day, Daniel watched Clara work, her movements precise, her face composed, the fabric bracelet peeking from under her sleeve when she reached for a coffee cup. He thought of her great-grandfather's hand pulling his own grandfather to safety in a muddy trench, the echo of that grip now alive in her. Clara caught him looking once, puzzled, but turned away quickly. She could not imagine the storm of memory and obligation building behind his gaze. For her, the battle was still today's rent, tonight's formula, tomorrow's shift. For him, the battle was how to honor a debt that could never truly be repaid. The answer, Daniel realized, was simple. He would not offer her pity. He would offer her a path, one rooted in history, watered by gratitude, and grown toward dignity. And somewhere, in the quiet space between memory and resolve, he felt the past shake hands with the present. The announcement came quietly at first, tucked inside a press release on a Thursday morning. Daniel Whitmore was establishing the Bennett Legacy Fund, a program designed to support descendants of veterans who had served with honor. Clara read the article on her phone during a lull at the diner, her hands trembling as she recognized her family name in bold print. She didn't know whether to feel pride or panic. For the first time, it seemed the world might open a door instead of closing one. But doors like that rarely stayed unguarded. By Friday afternoon, whispers had begun. At the counter, two regulars folded their newspapers and muttered, "Must be nice to catch a billionaire's eye." Online, comments multiplied. "She's milking the sympathy vote." Just another sob story attached to a rich man's conscience. And at the center of it all stood Victoria Hensley, her smile sharper than glass as she fed the flames. At a networking luncheon, she leaned into a cluster of executives. "Whitmore's bleeding heart is one thing, but handing funds to some waitress? Exploitation disguised as philanthropy. She saw an opportunity, and she's playing him." By evening, headlines echoed her spin. "Single mom cashes in on billionaire's guilt." Photos of Clara leaving the diner surfaced online, grainy and unforgiving. Strangers dissected her clothes, her posture, even the stroller she pushed. Inside her apartment, Clara sat at the small kitchen table, phone buzzing with messages she couldn't bear to open. Isla slept in the crib, one hand curled around the fabric bracelet, unaware of the storm gathering outside their thin walls. Clara pressed her palms to her face, the weight of it all pressing harder than rent ever had. She thought of quitting the diner before the stares grew sharper. She thought of pulling back from the fund, disappearing into anonymity, erasing herself from the story altogether. The shame burned hotter than the insults, because maybe, just maybe, they were right. Maybe she had stumbled into something she didn't deserve. On the counter lay a sheet of paper, blank except for the heading, "Resignation Letter." Clara had started it 3 times, the words blurring into defeat each time. Tonight she wrote again. "To whom it may concern." Halfway through, her pen faltered. She stood, crossed the room, and lifted Isla from the crib. The child stirred but didn't wake, nestling against her chest with a sigh. Clara held her close, rocking gently, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. For a fleeting moment, she considered packing a bag, leaving Chicago behind. Somewhere quieter, somewhere no one knew her name or her failures. She pictured a bus station at dawn, the hiss of brakes, a one-way ticket to anonymity. But when she looked down at Isla, small fingers clutching that bracelet, she knew escape wouldn't save them. What her daughter needed wasn't a mother who ran, but one who stood. Still, the fear was real. And as the night deepened, Clara sat in the dim light, with resignation crumpled in one hand and her daughter in the other. Caught between the urge to disappear and the fragile hope that somehow, against all odds, she might yet hold on. To the outside world, it looked like the tide had turned against her. Inside that apartment, it looked like she had nothing left. But beneath the silence, the story was far from finished. The press conference was supposed to be routine. Cameras lined the back of the room, microphones clustered on the podium like metal flowers, and reporters flipped through their notes, waiting for the story they'd already written in their heads. For Clara, the room felt like a trial. She sat in the front row, her palms damp, heart hammering against her ribs. Headlines over the past week had cut her down, reshaping her into a caricature. Opportunist, fraud, charity case. Whispers chased her everywhere, at the diner, on the street, even outside her apartment. She had almost left town, almost surrendered. But then she had seen Isla asleep with the bracelet wrapped tight around her wrist. That small circle of fabric had reminded her of who she was. Not a burden, not a fraud, but a mother. Daniel stood at the podium first, composed as always, his voice steady as he outlined the mission of the Bennett Legacy Fund. He spoke of service, of sacrifice, of families still paying debts carved decades before. His words landed well enough, but the questions came sharp and barbed. Mr. Whitmore, how do you respond to accusations that this fund is just a personal favor for a waitress you met at a diner? Another voice cut in before he could answer. Isn't this just pity dressed up as philanthropy? Clara's chest tightened. She could see the smirk on Victoria Hensley's face from across the room, seated among the executives like a queen among courtiers. The cameras turned, searching for her reaction. Daniel opened his mouth, but Clara rose before he could speak. The scrape of her chair echoed too loud. Reporters swiveled, flashbulbs popped. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself forward until she stood at the podium beside him. Her voice wavered at first, then grew clear. I didn't come here for pity, she said. I came here because I want the chance to work, to study, to build something better for my daughter. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Clara lifted her hand, holding up the small fabric bracelet that dangled from her wrist. Her eyes stung, but her words carried steady. This was made in the quiet hours, when the world was asleep and I was stitching hope into scraps of cloth. It may not look like much, but to me, and to her, it means we still have a future worth fighting for. She paused, scanning the faces in front of her. I don't want my daughter growing up believing she isn't worthy of a better life. I want her to know dignity, to know she comes from strength, not shame. The room hushed. Even the reporters lowered their pens, caught in the gravity of her words. Clara's voice softened. If that makes me a burden, then maybe the problem isn't with me. Daniel stepped forward then, his voice ringing firm. Clara is exactly the kind of person this fund was built for. Resilient, determined, unwilling to give up. Anyone who suggests otherwise has missed the point. His gaze flicked to Victoria, unflinching. This isn't exploitation. This is legacy, and legacy deserves honor, not mockery. For once, Victoria's smile faltered. The cameras caught it, the audience noticed, and a shift cracked through the room. Clara exhaled slowly. She hadn't planned to speak, hadn't planned to bare herself so publicly. But as the applause began, hesitant at first, then growing, she felt the weight on her chest loosen. She had spoken her truth, and no rumor could erase it now. Spring in Chicago came slowly, shy as a child stepping into a room. The streets thawed, tulips forced their way through cracks in the soil, and for the first time in months, Clara walked to the diner without her coat zipped to her throat. But this time she wasn't reporting for another shift. She was walking to a different door altogether, the downtown office that housed the Bennett Legacy Fund. The weeks after the press conference had been a blur. Reporters chased her at first, hungry for another headline. But the noise died down when people saw something they hadn't expected. She didn't vanish. She didn't crumble. She stood. And because she stood, Daniel stood with her. Victoria Hensley's smear campaign crumbled under inquiry, her polished veneer cracking as investigators uncovered her manipulations. Now Clara's name appeared not in gossip columns, but on program materials. Community Project Supervisor, Bennett Legacy Fund. It was more than a title. It was a bridge into a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Inside the office, the air smelled faintly of new paint and coffee. Desks gleamed, files stacked neatly, and sunlight poured through the wide windows. Clara sat at her new workstation, a modest space but wholly hers. Her tasks were simple at first: organizing local outreach, coordinating with veteran families, learning the systems, but each duty carried dignity. No one mocked her here. No one told her she wasn't fit to raise a child. Every morning, she dropped Isla off at daycare, tucking the fabric bracelet around her tiny wrist. The teachers adored her, marveling at how quickly she was growing stronger, her cheeks rounder, her coughs less frequent now that the special formula was steady on the shelf at home. One afternoon, Clara walked past a bulletin board where photos of supported families were pinned. She paused at a picture of an elderly man, his hands weathered, smiling with his grandchildren. A caption beneath read, "Descendant of Sergeant James Bennett, Woto Wutu." Her throat tightened. She reached out, touching the edge of the photo. For years, she had carried her family's history like a faded memory. Now it stood recognized, honored, alive. That weekend, the foundation hosted its opening ceremony. A crowd gathered under a white tent, flags rippling in the breeze. Daniel spoke about legacy, about sacrifice and gratitude, his voice carrying across the field. Then he stepped aside, gesturing for Clara to join him. She hesitated, Isla's small hand wrapped around her own. But the crowd welcomed her with warm applause, not mockery. She led Isla to the podium, heart pounding, but this time the fear didn't win. She didn't need to say much. Her presence told the story. A young mother once silenced by shame, now standing tall, her daughter at her side. The final image lingered long after the applause faded. Clara and Isla, hand in hand, smiling as the ribbon was cut, and the Bennett Legacy Fund officially opened. For Clara, it wasn't just a ceremony. It was proof that the threads of the past could weave something new, something whole. The world hadn't handed her a miracle. She had walked through fire, endured humiliation, and chosen to rise. And now, as Isla tugged on her hand and pointed toward the balloons lifting into the sky, Clara allowed herself to believe. The future could be brighter than she had ever dared to dream. Weeks turned into months, and Clara often found herself pausing in quiet moments to take it all in. The office lights at the Bennett Legacy Fund glowed late into the evenings. Papers spread across her desk as she coordinated community projects. It was hard work, but it was hers. Work that carried purpose rather than humiliation. Sometimes she caught her reflection in the office window at night. Not the waitress with weary eyes, not the mother weighed down by overdue bills, but a woman standing upright, her daughter's future no longer balanced on the edge of collapse. At home, Isla grew stronger, her cheeks full, her laugh bouncing off the apartment walls. She wore the fabric bracelet every day, though it dangled loosely on her small wrist. To Clara, it became more than a keepsake. It was a circle that carried the weight of her father's lullabies, her great-grandfather's courage, and the strength Clara herself had found when everything seemed ready to break. One evening, Daniel stopped by the office with a framed photograph. It showed two young soldiers in World War II, his grandfather and hers, grinning side by side in a rare moment of peace. And "I thought you should have this," he said simply. Clara held it in her hands, tracing the faces that had unknowingly bound their lives together decades before. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for this. For seeing me when no one else did." Daniel shook his head. "You were never invisible, Clara. The world just forgot how to look." Later that night, Clara tucked Isla into bed, humming the German lullaby as the city lights flickered outside. She thought of how close she had come to giving up, of the resignation letter still crumpled in a drawer, never delivered. She thought of Victoria's sneers, of the checkout line where she had set the formula back on the shelf, of the silence that had felt like rock bottom. And she thought of what had followed: the courage to endure, the choice to stand, the invisible threads of history that had guided her here. The lesson was clear, though she didn't write it down or speak it aloud. Motherhood never retreats. It bends, it breaks, it rebuilds. Even the smallest kindness, a stranger's glance, a memory carried forward, a hand offered instead of turned away, can alter the path of an entire life. To some, her story would always be about poverty or philanthropy, but to Clara, it was about love. Love in the form of a lullaby, a bracelet, a legacy carried across oceans and wars, all converging into one truth: she and Isla were worthy of better days. At the next foundation gathering, Clara stood at the entrance greeting families. Veterans' grandchildren, single parents, children clutching toys, faces filled with the same mixture of weariness and hope she had once worn. She welcomed each one, her voice warm, her posture steady. She was no longer just receiving a second chance. She was helping build them for others. As she watched Isla toddle toward her, laughing in the sunlight, Clara understood the story wasn't finished. It never would be. Threads of the past, woven through acts of courage and compassion, would keep carrying forward. And maybe, just maybe, someone else would find strength in her story. The reminder that even when everything seems lost, there are invisible ties holding us steady, waiting for the moment we dare to rise.